Good morning. I'm just checking if I'm audible.
Morning, Mr. Niehaus. Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. While I have you on the line, and has there been any response to those questions of ours from the NCACC?
Not yet. Even yesterday, I asked Willem to ask the Mr. Mashaba again himself now, and still nothing.
Okay, thank you. We'll deal with it in the meeting. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to know in case they have sent something. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, members. Good morning. Do we have everyone on the platform? Do we have a quorum?
Good morning, Chair.
Good morning, Chair. So far we only have 4 members, Chair. So we don't have the quorum as yet.
Okay. I see other members are still joining. So maybe we'll give them a little bit of time. I hope, Nandi, you will alert me when we have a quorum.
Okay, Chair, but Chair, we can start the meeting, but when the committee has to take a decision, then we will need the quorum. But I think for now, the meeting can start, Chair.
Okay. And we have the delegation from the National Defence Force. Seems that we do. I see the Chief of Staff is here.
Recording in progress.
General Yekelo is here. Brigadier General Niabo Mana is also here. The Deputy Minister Mkungo is here. Do we know if the minister is joining the meeting?
Yes, Chair. The PLO said to me she will join the meeting today.
Okay. Well,
Chair, while we're waiting for the quorum,
yes.
Can I just indicate the issue of our next oversight on the 24th and 28th? That there's a challenge.
May I request, Chair, without interrupting you, that we deal with it at the end of the meeting?
At the end of the meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
When we conclude the presentation by the Reserve Force Council.
No, it's okay, it's fine.
Thank you. Colleagues, the agenda, this meeting is for the introductory engagement with the Reserve Force Council and briefing on the status of the SANDF Reserve Force, its utilization and challenges, including plans for its rejuvenation. Now, it's therefore an introductory meeting in its nature. The presentation will indicate to us what is the status of the Reserve Force since its establishment and what is the future envisaged for the Reserve Force. We hope to finish the meeting at 12 o'clock. I thank all members for joining at this time. Without wasting time, can we receive apologies?
Good morning, Chair, honorable members, and the Deputy Minister in the platform. I've only got 2 apologies. One from Mr. Hwase, who will be chairing the Select Committee on Appropriations, and also from Ms. Brett, who has another engagement. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have, the agenda has been presented. Do we have a mover and seconder for the agenda? For the adoption of the agenda?
I'll approach the Chair.
Okay, Chair, I move for it to be adopted, but I also want to raise an issue which I would like to be addressed at the end of the meeting, and that is the apparent absence of still any answer from the National Conventional Arms Control Committee with regards to the questions that we have sent to them. I noted that you and the co-chair had written a letter to the NCACC and also to the DCACC, and apparently there had been no response to those letters that requested for our answers to be provided. So, Chair, I'm requesting that we add that as a matter to the agenda after we have received the various presentations that we are here for this morning. Thank you. But otherwise, I second the move by Mr. Hutton, by the Honourable Hutton, to adopt the agenda. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So, colleagues, what will happen after item four, before we consider after we consider the minutes, that will be after item 5. We will then deal with one, the matter of the NCACC, which had been raised, and two, the issue of the oversight visit. So we'll deal with them after item 5. Thank you very much. The agenda has been moved for adoption, and that was seconded. The minister is now on the platform. Without really further ado, I would like to hand over to the minister to introduce the team from the National Defence Force and introduce the briefing to us. Honorable Lehuase, your note is your message is noted. Thank you very much for joining, albeit briefly. Minister, I hand over to you.
No, good morning, Chair, and let me greet all the members of the committee, but also the officials that are with us from the department. The team is led by our Secretary of Defense, Chief Ramatwana, and then the presentations are going to be done by the two generals, and then I think he'll introduce them. But without taking your time, Chair, let me thank you very much for the opportunity, and we'll ask General Ramatwana to introduce the team, especially the presenters, the two presenters, and the team that we have on the platform. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister. Chief Ramatwana, you may proceed. I think what we will do, because these presentations on the Reserve Force Council and the Reserve Force are related, we will take both of them at the same time, after which we will then have a discussion. So you may proceed.
Chairperson, thank you very much, and greetings to the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Enji Mutsecha, and greetings to all honorable members present in this committee today. Chairperson, I would want, without any waste of time, to introduce our two presenters, starting with General Yekelo, and to say that the main aim here is introductory, as you mentioned it in your preamble to today's meeting, and General Yekelo has been appointed by the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans as the chairperson of the Reserve Force Council with effect from December, and now hard at work in a process to try and select some additional members of the Reserve Force Council. And he is here ready to present, to take us through the presentation. Thereafter, as you directed, Chairperson, it is going to be Brigadier General Niabo that will be taking us through the current status with regards to the reserve force, and it's more of an informative session, a briefing session to bring the honorable members to come to an understanding where do we stand with regards to the reserve force in the South African National Defence Force. With that being said, therefore, Chairperson, may I request General Yekelo to take us through you, sir. Thank you very much. General Yekelo.
Thank you, Honorable Chair and Co-Chair. Let me also greet the Honorable Minister and the head deputies and all the members of the committee. This is my first appearance at this joint standing committee. And as General Manswana has stated, this is more of an introductory brief. I was appointed by the Minister of Defense with effect from 1st December 2024 as the new chairperson of the Reserve Force Council. That was after the last council's term had expired in 2021. Its term had been from 2016 to 2021, a 5-year term. The former minister, then Honorable Tandem Dise, gave a brief extension from December 2022 to June 2023. And after that, the council was never reconstituted. Honorable Minister Motshekga then resumed the process of reconstituting the Reserve Force Council with effect from October, when she approved a submission made by the SANDF. And she then appointed me as chair, appointed an additional member as councillor, who has been a member of the past council, which is something I welcomed because that brought in the issue of continuity to institutional memory and that. She also appointed the Secretariat of the Reserve Force Council, which will contribute to stability, stable administrative element that can carry forward even beyond the incoming council's term. I then assumed duty on the 20th of January. Apologies for that. From then on, I've been seized with the task of working to ensure that we can start reconstituting the Reserve Force Council. I'll invite Ms. Rangwako to fly to the slides so that I can begin with my presentation.
I am in the committee, joint standing committee, but the reason I called you was with regards.
Thank you, Chair.
Are we supposed to be hearing that? Sorry, I wanted to suggest that we all mute ourselves except the presenter. Thank you.
Can I proceed, Chair?
Yes, you may proceed, General.
Okay. As indicated on this first slide, this is an information brief on the Reserve Force Council, which will deal, among others, the purpose, structure, operations of the Reserve Force Council. I regard this as important because it is possible that some members of the committee may be new to the committee. And since I indicated in my introductory remarks that the council is only going to be reconstituted by the minister in the near term. The aim is to brief the Joint Standing Committee on Defense and Military Veterans on the purpose, structure, and the operations of the Reserve Force Council. Next slide. This is the content briefly. The status of the Reserve Force is that the Reserve Force Council, that is the current status. the mandate, which is very important to know that this is a mandated structure in terms of Defence Act number 42 of 2002, that it works within the legal framework. When issues of law and legislation arise, the council approaches the state law advisor and gets an opinion. Briefly mention the regulations of the Reserve Force Council and the Constitution. I will then move on to the question of nomination, the appointment of chairperson, which I've already mentioned, then the process of nomination and appointment of councillors, which is underway, a bit on the structure, which is an old structure, but it's useful for you to give you an idea. I am of the view that the new council will try to revise the structure to make it current. Then we'll deal with just show what's the budget in terms of what's in the APP, which we are in the process of trying to revise and update in anticipation of the appointment a little bit later on of the new council. And then the assets, the responsibilities of the council, the operations or actions of activities of the council, contractual obligations, key focus areas, and the audit findings. Next slide. Now, briefly, it's always important to mention a bit of background. Initially, the council was formed as a result of concerns in the late period of the past dispensation, concern about the future of the part-time forces component, then of the SANDF, and which was soon to become part of the forces constituting the SANDF. This is because the part-time forces had not been part of the JMCC process that was debating, among others, issues of integration and the establishment of the new defense force. It's important to note this. It always happens, not only characteristic of South Africa, but also in other countries where the reserve forces was very important as a core component of armed forces, but they usually sometimes treated as stepchildren, which should not be the case. Post 1990, during that process, within the JMCC framework, there were negotiations about the future of reserve force and future of a reserve force. Post 1994, the reserve forces status became of the Reserve Force Council as representing the reserves became statutory in terms of Defence Act number 42 of 2002, specifically clause 48. What also at that stage then, a decision that was taken was that because the Reserve Force Council resides under and reports directly to the Minister of Defense in playing its advisory and consultative role, that how were its affairs such as budget and that going to be managed. A decision was then taken that its affairs would be managed through a transfer payment from the DOD through the Chief of Corporate Staff, now Chief of Staff, General Ramantswana's division, that's right, through the offices of Chief Defence Reserves, now Acting Chief Defence Reserves. The management, the control of the budget of the Reserve Force Council is prescribed within that particular Department of Defence instruction. FIN number is reflected, and the Joint Defence Publication Finance, which is reflected also there, which were published in 2002 and 2003, respectively. We are relooking certain aspects of that to keep up with the times. In 2005, there was a chief SANDF consultation instruction, because what had then happened with the the Chief Corporate Staff and Environment through Chief Defence Reserves becoming the performance manager of the Reserve Force Council. That's right. At that time, also the Reserve Force Council had an observer status within the DSC and the PS and the PDSC. It was then decided, no, there should be one entry point, which should be Chief Defence Reserves, who currently sits on the command bodies of the DOD and the SANDF. That was resolved through that instruction in 2005. This was very important to ensure that there is alignment between what the Reserve Force Council does and what is done by the Chief Defence Reserves. In 2013, the RFC, Reserve Force Council in full, revised its constitution and regulations, updated them. They have not been updated since. The new council, when it is appointed by the minister, will look into that as a matter of urgency. I mentioned this already, that there's been no RFC from December 2021, basically to November 2024. The last bullet is just mention of the fact that the submission was submitted in this regard to the minister, who approved it, and in the end appointed myself as chair with effect from the 1st of December. Next slide. The mandate of the Reserve Force Council. I just want to mention here briefly, it's very self-explanatory, that the Reserve Force Council's mandate is derived from the Defence Act number 42 of 2002, clause 48, which itself is derived from the Constitution. And it instructs the minister directs the minister to establish the Reserve Force Council, and that the minister must appoint no fewer than 9, but no more than 18 persons to become councillors of the Reserve Force Council, and must designate one of them as chairperson, which Honorable Mutsecha has already done. The council must conduct its business in accordance with the constitution adopted by it and approved by the minister. I've already stated that the constitution exists. The new council, when it is appointed, it will review it so that even the signature on the constitution is updated by the current minister. The council is consultative and advisory body representing the reserve forces. This is in order to promote and maintain the force as an integral part of the defense force, and must be consulted on any legislation, policy, or administrative measures affecting the reserve force. It's important that I just emphasize this mandate, the consultative, meaning that it must consult with the Secretariat, consult with the SANDF, the Chief of Services, and all of that, and also consult with external stakeholders so as to be able to provide the required advice to the minister. Next slide. Just in terms of task as part of the mandate, the minister obviously may give any task to the council, but also that the Secretary for Defense and the Chief of Defense may also request the council to execute and investigate certain matters that relate to the upkeep and promotion and development of the reserves. It's important, this bullet number 6 is very important for clarity. The council has no command powers, has no administrative powers over the reserves. This is very important. Sometimes this is misunderstood, but I can assure members, as I've assured the minister, that the new council will not deviate from this. It knows its lane. That is the clear prescription of its lane. Point number 7, the minister may make such regulations regarding the Reserve Force Council as may be required. This is very important. This has already been mentioned that I've been appointed, but I just inform the members that as soon as the minister appoints the new council, after she has considered the nominations, the motivations, and the profiles, then after approval, this will be referred for publishing in the Government Gazette. Next slide. State Law Advisor's opinion. Well, this is just important for members to know that everything in the past and now and going forward done by the Council will involve the State Law Advisor in terms of advice, whether it's the regulations, whether it's the Constitution currently and or as revised. This will be referred for them for opinion to be able to state clearly that it is in line with the law and legislation. The appointment of members, as I've already stated, will be according to the Act and regulations. I must state the process of nomination was done, nomination was received, and the process of selection of what we regard as the best candidates for now is being consolidated and prepared for submission to the minister, and it will all be in line with the regulations. The bullet number 5, I've already dealt with it, and bullet number 6. Next slide. This is just to give you a brief, just for you to scan what the Constitution of the Reserve Force Council is, and this can be availed to members if they would want to see it. Perhaps preferably if they could wait for the new when the council is appointed and then has reviewed it and has said it's fine, we can proceed with it as is, or suggest some tweaking here and there. Then the members can also look at it. That would be my suggestion. The Constitution covers the status, objects, missions, and aims of the council, how the council should conduct its affairs, guiding principles, the association of the reserve forces, the questions around the national secretary and the secretariat. I've already indicated that the minister has already appointed a secretariat when he appointed the chair and an additional member. Then the Constitution also deals with the functions, the maintenance liability of the national executive of the council. Cases where there's leave of absence, what subordinate structures, and for instance, the question of convening of research teams is also covered in the Constitution, because the council will, in the course of work, have to conduct research to be able to provide advice. What are the regions in which across the provinces of the country there are reserve forces, and then the constituents of the council who then are representative of the reserve forces. The next slide. Then the nature and extent of consultation with the council. I've already touched on that, who the council will consult broadly within the department and externally. The mandate and execution of tasks and programs. In terms of the last constitution, there was a biannual meeting with the minister to receive tasks. We will stick to this unless the minister revises it. And we should also cover the question of powers, functions, and meetings of the council. The international representation, may I just mention this briefly? It's always important for defense forces, like other constituents in governments. It is important to maintain international representation where possible and where necessary, because these are representations which are strategic, which help assist with benchmarking and keeping up to world-class standards as much as we can. Then also the question of the funding of the council. It deals with the possibility of dual remuneration and how should it arise, it should be eliminated. The financial and accounting responsibility, the code of conduct, recognition of meritorious service, limitations of liabilities and rights, amendments of constitution, and disestablishment. I think members will gather from this scope of what the constitution covers that this is a constitution which is appropriate to cover and give direction to the work of the council. Next slide. These are very important matters that which are imperatives, that the RFC must be optimally representative in terms of demographics, and diversity and geographical distribution. I've mentioned the procedures for nomination, and these have been followed. And the selection of new office bearers within the RFC will be done as soon as the RFC is appointed. And then the nominations and invitation, I've already stated, this has been done. The Constitution also mentions that there must be a national secretariat. I've indicated that this has already been appointed by the minister. It will execute those tasks under the guidance of the council. Next slide. This is just a structure, and I would perhaps request the members not to belabor the structure, but just look at it. This was the structure as it was. That's right. We will then, as the new council, have to consider whether this structure needs revision, but certain elements, for instance, of this structure will still remain. And some of those commitments, if you see the international obligations, which I've already mentioned, the benefits and renewal, policy advice, some projects like the University Reserve Training Program, which is now defunct, which was quite a very promising and strategic program by the DOD at a certain stage, but then unfortunately due to various factors was discontinued. The questions of skills training, which are very important going forward in terms of how do we maintain and sustain reserves who are part-time soldiers. What happens when they are not called up? Those are issues that the council will be seized with, and in order to ensure that it supports the department, advises the minister, and on how to make sure that we maintain a viable reserve force. Next slide. This just briefly is the allocated budget. As you can see, as I've indicated, the Reserve Force Council is funded from a transfer payment from the DOD, which is managed through the Chief of Staff Environment and the Chief Defense Reserves. This appears on an APP, which we are in the process of just revising it before submitting it. And we will be submitting it on time as required. Then this is how it stays at present. But do note that this is the budget. What has been factored in there is even the costs that will arise when the council has been appointed by the minister. This is a budget going forward, starting with the current and the next 2 financial years. Next slide. I've touched on this. I may just quickly pass it if Chair, you agree, because I've already Tash described how the budget process is controlled within the Department of Defense environment, with the transfer payments done, controlled by the Chief of Corporate, or former Chief of Corporate Staff, now Chief of Staff, and the Defense Force Reserve Division. If I may just mention bullet 3.1, what are these funds for? Payments to office bearers, funding, for instance, of delegations, of teams that participate in international military competitions. As I've indicated, these competitions are very important for the SANDFs to remain current, conversant with international standards on various aspects of military science, and therefore the reserves too should be current. It will cover those travel costs locally and externally. These military competitions, which also includes shooting competitions, the question of young reserve officers, contractual applications, and in any identified projects in support of the reserves, which are projects will mostly be around the question of development and maintenance, sustenance of the reserves. Next slide. The Reserve Force Council offices are accommodated by grace of Daniel and the military health services at Littleton, in the place called LIW. Some members might know the area. Daniel, as you just enter the city. It was allocated a single floor on a building, and the offices are adequate, as far as I'm concerned, for the needs of the council. And the other facilities that it has is an obstacle training field in Potchefstroom, at the military base in Potchefstroom. It also has got building and storage facility for equipment that is used whenever the SANDF, the Reserve Forces, hosts military skills training and competitions. This is very important because sometimes it hosts international players, as we also too are hosted abroad, and our members do attend competitions abroad. So this is a state-of-the-art facility, which is along the same lines and standards, normal standards internationally, and it has been used repeatedly in the past. The Reserve Force Council assist with maintaining that from its budget, and also to a certain extent the SA Army. Next slide. Just briefly to mention these responsibilities, which are concerned in paragraph 81, chapter 10 of the Defense Review, that the RFC further the principles of maintenance of a viable reserve component by promoting the one force approach, which in terms of defense planning and administration, which basically means, in my view, that one force approach means that the reserves mustn't be seen as a stepchild. The reserves must be seen as, whilst part-time, but as a core component of the country's defense capability. Also, it must promote effective resourcing, capacitation, preparation, functioning, and utilization of the reserves. This is where the consultation, advocacy, promotion, and advice comes in as part of this promotion of the reserves. The Reserve Council is also then expected to evaluate and consult on any matter of legislation, policy, administration that may impact on the reserve component and advise accordingly. We will be looking into it deeply, for instance, into say, does the current legislation support the one force concept or approach, for instance. But that's a task for the new council to deal with and submit to the minister and to the committee. Next slide. It must also advise the Defence Force Service Commission, specifically with regards to the dispensation on service conditions and benefits of the Reserve Force component. Benefits not only when they are called up, but also dispensation with regards when they are not called up. So that the fact that they are not called up mustn't mean they are forgotten. That they must be looked after somehow as much as is possible. The research and advice to the minister, research or investigate advice on any matter as requested. I've already mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation. And then also maintain relations with International Reserve Force Officers Association as directed by the minister. Next slide. May I just mention with regards to International Reserve Forces Association, I found an outstanding task that the past council had given itself, that it must also engage with our SADC and AU counterparts to see how we can not just be affiliated only to the international, but that we work together even as Africans, as in SADC, to establish our own sort of reserve forces set up, because all country needs to have an established and viable reserve force elements. These are the responsibilities and mandated obligations to maintain these international relations, to support and make sure that the annual military skills competition, which is about maintenance of norms and standards, is hosted by the SANDF with invited international participation. That international participation that's invited to our own competition here is very important, because our own soldiers can benchmark themselves against others from other countries, which is very important. Support the annual shooting competition, in addition to the costs that are incurred by the SA Army. The SA Army has been very supportive of this. A week ago, I had paid a courtesy visit to the Chief Army, and I can confirm the support of the Army will still be going forward into the future. Very soon, I'll also be meeting the other chiefs of the services. Also, then we need to support the young reserve force officers. This will be another focus area to ensure that we develop a core of young reserve force officers going forward, because that becomes critical for maintenance of a viable reserve component. Operational and contractual obligation, we have got some, I'll mention them. This includes for instance, the payment of the support staff, the maintenance of the offices, services and equipment which needs maintenance. Next slide. The focus areas will be, among others, the following. One, the ongoing challenge, which I've been informed, and I'm meeting the Surgeon General next week, but I've already been informed that he has already taken decisions in this regard to ensure that the medical benefits for reserve force on call up are in place. The members can be attended to, and if possible, which may need some negotiation to be on par with the military veterans. Personally, I'm not allowed to make a personal opinion, but my thoughts are along those lines. The skills training for reserve force members. This is very important. As the chair, as you will know, co-chairs and members, the recruiting pool of the SANDF, as in every country, the recruiting pool is not from the elite or the relatively well-to-do or the well-to-do. It's a well practice. That's all right. Yeah. The social composition. And many of these reserve force members that we recruit come from backgrounds that are struggling to make ends meet, and they don't have skills except many of them just having the basic matric. Now, when they recruited into the Defence Force and then are not contracted and then they are offloaded into the reserves, they do not have skills. This is an area of work. Some work has been done, but we seek to consolidate and intensify this work, that it doesn't become ad hoc, it doesn't become a matter of goodwill, that it becomes guaranteed. Because when it is guaranteed, I believe it will be much easier to attract more to the reserves, because it will be linked to becoming a reserve, getting military training, getting deployed, but being guaranteed access to skills, training, educate skills that can lead the member to one, ensure that he can get employed or become self-employed or start his or her own business. This is very critical in my view, and it will need support. To assist in the broader rejuvenation of reserves. And then we also have found there's a project that was ongoing, which will also be continued, of establishing a jobs portal with relation to the industry, the private sector, and broadly the rest, so that they know that this is what the reserves had, and then these are potentially the employment possibilities. We'll then also maintain the international relations, as I've said. And as I've said, one objective will be to establish relations within SADC and the African continent in the reserve force environment. Next slide. Briefly on the internal audit division. That's right. As I arrived in January, I found that the internal audit division had conducted an audit over the period July 2024 to December and made findings. The findings are, among others, one, there was no constituted council. As I've indicated, the term of the last council ended in 2021, was briefly renewed from December 2022 to June 2023. After that, there was no council. Honorable Minister Mtsecha now has begun the process of establishing the new council. And these audit findings occurred in an environment where the secretariat staff, basically, which became a skeleton staff, in the sense that it was not working under a constituted council. And then some audit findings arose. One, for instance, the transfer payment is not always utilized for its intended purposes. This matter is being dealt with, has been dealt with, and the MOU was outdated. It has been outdated. On my part, I've signed it. It's awaiting SANDF's signature. Then the necessary business plans, performance agreements, not as submitted. That was as the auditor found in the past, but I think all of that may have been due to mostly the question of no council being appointed. The implementation of effective, efficient, and transparent financial arrangement management in relation to the following. Next slide. Rectification plans must be submitted to address the findings. We are in the process, Chair, co-chairs, and members, of preparing we are already, the rectification plan is underway, and we're preparing a report of how we are rectifying some of the issues that have been pointed out in the audit finding. I've already mentioned the question of appointment of the RFC, which will be coming a little bit later. The issue of appointment letters and performance agreements of members, specifically now of the Secretariat, this is underway. and update all management directive. This is underway. I can assure you we're busy with that process. The SAGE is the financial system that the Reserve Force Council use because it's not on the financial system of the DoD. And I would say it's better staying like that. The procurement process, yes, the directives relating to this control and audit, all of these are currently underway. I'm working together with the ministerially appointed secretariat. Next slide. Before I just conclude, let me state the following. As a result of this finding, 1 or 2 points which related to financial management, which were flagged by the internal auditor, I've then, to satisfy the process of the corrective plan, I've in the process of constituting a board of inquiry, which should start not later than Monday in doing the investigation. It's not an extensive investigation. Everything, the related information and then individuals to be interviewed are available. It will be, and the person the service has nominated is quite experienced in doing the boards of inquiry. So I expect this, the board of inquiry will be we will be able to meet the auditor's request that all of this rectification plan be submitted before March, the end of March, which is the 31st of March. To conclude then, Chair, let me state the following. The chairperson, as I already indicated, has now been appointed, and this has opened the way for the nomination and appointment of new Reserve Force councillors. I've said this, the question of appointment is on my desk. I'm busy with that, preparing the submission and that to the minister. We will take a time to consider this and then decide on appointing on the appointment of the nominated members. That will then kickstart the process of us having a fully constituted Reserve Force Council. The Defence Reserves Division has been supporting the ongoing operational responsibilities of the Reserve Force Council as per its role as the performance manager, and will continue to support the Reserve Force Council in fulfilling its objectives. As the new chair, I don't foresee any issues in this regard. We're already working. We have started off the blocks together and working in unison. And I think this will be concretized when I pay a courtesy visit also to the Chief of Staff at his convenience. The guiding principle, chairs and members and minister and your deputies, is that should be to provide a platform, that is the Reserve Force Council, to provide a platform, continued debate, I use the term debate or discussion, on the reform of the SANDF, the rejuvenation, membership, positioning, preparation, utilization and management of the SANDF reserves, given the changing strategic environment facing the DoD. May I just explain a bit about what I say here as I conclude? I mentioned a term that may not be usual within the DoD, but my understanding is that the Defense Review 2015 is exactly about that, reform. That's all right. The worldwide practice is that almost every 5 years, institutions such as the defense go through reviews. For various reasons, we may not have done that, with the last review having been in 1998 and the next one being in 2015. I'm happy to hear that there's some strategic something that is coming out soon, which I've not yet seen, which deals with these factors. It's very important, in my view, this is arguable, that there is to note that the rejuvenation of the reserves, in my view, can be done in two ways. One, through direct recruitment into the reserves, which is impacted and can be promoted through resolutions of the issues of funding and all of that within the Department of Defense, funding for the SANDF itself, and allocations of funding for that. But also, another stream of rejuvenation of the reserves is by the SANDF itself, the regulars becoming a feeder to the reserves, which has now basically stopped because of the issues around the budget and all of that, constraints, austerities, around the funding for the Defence Force and the less recruitment into the Defence Force. But may I just throw this, also this idea with regards to reform. Reform would then also mean, in my view, that if this is going to be done to rejuvenate the Defence Force itself so that it can become a feeder to the reserve forces, and that the other stream being the direct recruitment into the reserves, for this to happen, there will have to be a relook of the human resources dispensation in the SANDF itself. I'll leave it at there at this point. I intended the most at the earliest opportunity where I think I can have to discuss this with the minister, expatiate much more on this matter. But this is key, and I see, as I'm concluding, Chair, I see that there's a possibility of a brighter future for the Defence Force if we can just look beyond, not only at the budget, but also look at reform. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Honourable Minister.
Honourable members, please mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves. Please don't forget to mute yourselves. Thank you very much, General Yegelo, for a very energetic presentation. I think whilst we note the challenges, we also will note that your appointment has brought about much needed energy to putting the reserve force in good shape. But I will leave that and other issues for members to comment on. Can we go now to the presentation on the reserve force? Or did you just do the whole presentation at once?
No, sir, we did not.
Oh, okay. So let's move to the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The Honorable Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Mayor Angie Motshekga, the Chairperson of the Committee, Honorable Mr. Gigaba, and your members, the Chief of Staff of the South African National Defence Force, Chairperson of the Reserve Force Council, and the rest of the members of the committee present here today, good morning. I'm Brigadier General Zolekani Abomana, Acting Chief Defence Reserves. I'll be presenting the status, the challenges, and the strategy for the rejuvenation of the reserve here today. Colonel Van Wyk, can you please flight the presentation?
My apology, I'm disabled. Can the chair, the host, just please release me?
Nandipa, I'm trying to see.
I have done something.
Yes, it's we have three hosts. Can you please enable the presentation to be flighted?
Ms. Elsa is the co-host now, so she can.
Thank you, sir. As I have already stated, I will be presenting the status of the Reserve Force component in the entire Defence Force. Next slide. The aim of my presentation is exactly that, to present the status of the South African National Defence Force Reserves to the committee. Next slide. These are the contents of my presentation. Aim as already stated, then I will introduce my presentation. I will explain the role of the reserves, their strength and utilization, the challenges faced by the reserves in the department, and the plans that the department has decided on to rejuvenate the reserve force component. And then I will conclude. Next slide, please. This is the regulatory framework which the use and utilization of the reserves emanate from. First is the Constitution, then the Defense Review of 2015, which we're in the process of reviewing. However, even when the Defense Review has been reviewed, the role of the reserves will remain the same. The only thing that might change is the extent to which the reserves are employed and utilized by the department. And the focus areas by the Minister of Defense Force based on the directive is that we maximize the combat capability of the South African National Defence Force by staffing the combat units with existing young, healthy and fit soldiers. This speaks to the rejuvenation that we are about to embark on. Also that we ensure the retention of technical, medical and other scarce skills that are required by different services. And that we drive career management and succession planning in pursuit of a young, professionalized and skilled defence force that includes our reserves. This has been adversely impacted by the budget because for the past 5 to 6 years, we have not been able to recruit any reserve force members. Hence, the average age continued to rise from the age of 45 to now standing at 49. And then the plan is that we should overhaul the entire reserve force service system in order for it to be able to perform its roles and augment the regular force members in performing the operations of the Defence Force. Next slide. This is the role of the reserves as stated in the Defence Act and the Defence Review. They are there to augment regular force members in any operation, whether it's peace support operation, border safeguarding, Operation Corona, which forms part of our mandate, the support to the people, including developmental agenda. This we do through Operation Chariot when there are disasters or unrest in the country, or we are requested to support the police in any security matter that they feel overwhelmed as instructed by the president. The reserves also provide a component of core defense capability because every time we have to deploy internally, when we don't have sufficient regular force combat ready forces, then we augment them by the reserves. They provide expansion capability like we did in the unrest when we require more soldiers and some of our soldiers are deployed externally. Then we call up the reserves to provide this expansion capability and complement the regular force members. They contribute to the deterrence capability because you cannot really state to have any meaningful deterrence if you don't have combat readiness forces. So the reserve force members continue to play this role. They provide certain specialists and scarce skills to the DoD through different services. When there was a pandemic in 2021, for instance, Military Health Service, which is SAMS, called up their retired nurses and other doctors that they have in their reserve force component because we did not have sufficient doctors and nurses to deal with the pandemic, and the reserve force members played this role successfully. Hence, we could manage to support the country. They enhance the relationship with the department and the public and private sectors. We have a relationship with different entities. We had one with PRASA, where they took some of our reserve force members and provide them with alternative employment. Because the ideal meaning of a reserve force member is a member who has a permanent alternative member, but is enlisted as a reserve and will come once a year for continuation training so that we know we have a list of reserve force members that we have should we require them. Because security issues that require employment of defense forces emanate at times within hours. That is why it's important that at all times we have combat-ready forces, because you can't start recruiting and training people when you need to deploy them. So this is the ideal meaning of a reserve force member, a part-time force member. However, in our situation, most of our reserve force members, in fact, more than 90%, do not possess any alternative employment. In the past, when we did not have any budgetary constraints issues, this was not an issue because reserve force members were called up continuously and they were guaranteed a salary. So most of them became relaxed in thinking that they possess a permanent employment, even though this should not be the case. But when we started having problems with our cost of employment and were compelled to reduce the number of soldiers, the first thing that we did was to reduce the number of days that we call up and utilize our reserve force members. Some services will reduce their reserve force days to 10 days a month. Some, like the army, they will only call them up for 6 months and other ones for the other 6 months while they are unemployed in the other times that they are not called up because of budgetary constraint. So this has been a struggle. The only thing that we've been getting is that we've been getting development and rescaling opportunities from different entities. Telkom, for instance, 2 years ago, they trained our reserve force members on coding, which is an IT skill, but they could not place them in any employment capacity. However, they now possess the skill. Currently, we are busy with a project where Masiete has given us funds to reskill our reserve force members in different functions depending on the requirements of the department, or for them to be able to seek alternative employment or to be self-sufficient in other skills where they can be self-employed. So this is an ongoing matter for the department. The business case for the reserve force, we always say that it's cheaper to have reserve force members. Hence, other countries in peace times, they will have a larger reserve force component than the regular force component. However, that is not the case in our country. And the only thing that we need to do is to have a policy position where we decide how much of our force we would like to be reserved. The international norm is that countries will have 40% reserves of their total force. However, ours varies now from 15% to 22%. However, when this decision has been taken, then we will have established 30% reserve. 7.6% of the army budget goes to pay the reserves. We've taken the sample of army because army is the biggest force and they are the biggest employer of reserve force members. While 50% effort is given by the reserve in the Operation Corona, which is safeguarding, because 50% of members that are manning our borders are reserve force members. So only 7.6 budget is utilized to pay their reserve force wages, but the effort is 50%. So this is cheaper because you also don't have to have any budget for the pension of the reserves, as they are not entitled to pension. They are only remunerated when they are called up and utilized. Also, we utilize them in Operation Prosper. All our internal operations fall under Operation Prosper. The ESCOM operation that we assisted in is part of Prosper. Illegal mining is part of Prosper. Unrest were part of Prosper. Any requirement that is internal falls under Prosper, and most of these are meant by the reserves. Next slide. Here we're stating the role of the reserves. Their conventional function is to enhance the capacity of the regular force members, like I have said, and reinforce and strengthen them. When we don't have sufficient combat-ready forces, then we supplement them by calling up the reserves and utilizing them. The immediate deployable capability, like I've mentioned an example of the unrest in 2021, where we were required to employ and deploy forces within 24 hours. We had MCC meeting where after 2 hours we had to get out of the meeting and make sure that we deploy forces to provide stability in the country. This we use reserves, but this requires that you always have combat-ready forces, because when you have to deploy them, there is no time to train them. But what we've been having difficulties with is continuation training that is required in order for us to ensure that our reserve force members remain combat ready. because of the budgetary constraints, there is not sufficient funds for us to call up reserves at times, train them and utilize them. So the services are always balancing whether you call them up to train them or utilize them. And this poses a risk to our operations, because if we say we fight as we trained, then we cannot afford to have reserve force members that don't have the same training that our regular force members have, because when we deploy as the South African National Defence Force, not as regular force and reserve force members. So it is important for us to provide continuation training for our reserve force members, but it's not always possible because of budget. The Mzansi Home Guard, this is the function that the Army is working on to ensure that we have intelligence capability to our deployed forces in Operation Corona, which is border safeguarding. Because as we know, we don't have sufficient soldiers manning the entire borderline. So if we can complement this by making sure that we have adequate intelligence provided to Operation Corona, this will make up for instances where we have not deployed forces, because we currently only have 16 companies in the borders and what is required is 22. So the reserve force members through Mzansi Home Guard will provide this intelligence capability so that our forces that are deployed in the borders have sufficient information. The specialist capability, like I've already mentioned, with SAMs, it will be doctors and nurses. In the Air Force, for instance, it might be aviation engineer. In the Navy, it be marine combat, depending on the unique requirement of that particular service. But most services are struggling to maintain this specialist capability, also because of budget. But it is a requirement that we are trying to balance and manage. Next slide. To create a structure to maintain the critically needed mastering within the South African Air Force, supported by an effective feeder and training system. For the past 6 years, we have not had any feeder for the Reserve Force service system throughout the entire department, because we have not recruited any Reserve Force member. The reason for this is that when we're trying to maintain the cost of employment that is at currently 16 billion deficit, this has been rising over the years, because every financial year, the allocation that we get from National Treasury to pay our soldiers is less than the number of soldiers that we have. So one of the decisions that was taken was to reduce the number of days that we call up our reserves from 2.6 to 1.9, even though the actual requirement has been showing us that we've been using more than 3 million reserves because of audit commitments. However, the decision was taken to reduce the number of days. This impacted negatively the different services reserves. For instance, in the Air Force, they used to have Air Reserve Squadron, where retired pilots would come in and assist with flying time of the Air Force. Some of them will even bring their own aircraft. But the Air Force, in the past 2 to 3 years, they could not activate these squadrons because of budgetary constraints as well, because they can no longer afford them, even though the requirement is still there. We also had a program of University Reserve Training Program that was, you would find across all services in the department, where they will recruit university students in our quest to professionalize the Defence Force and ensure that in the future, all our officers are graduates. All services agreed that this was a useful program, but almost all of them could not continue with it because they cannot afford it. Because when you recruit these university students, you must give them basic training and officers forming training, because graduates become officers in the department. So they could not afford to continue with this because of the budgetary constraints. Like I have said, we're struggling with the utilization of the Reserve Force members that we have. So recruiting has been a problem. Hence, the average age of the Reserve Force member has been growing unabated because there was no injection at all. Specialist capabilities, as I've stated, it differs from service to service based on their requirement. In the military health service, it will be doctors and nurses. In the Air Force, it will be engineers and pilots. In the Navy, it will be marine combat and any marine-related professional. And then in the Army, it will the requirement. It will be lawyers at some instances or writers. It depends on whatever the requirement that is there at the time. Next slide. This I've already mentioned. The Naval Reserve will remain the main provider of manpower for sea border patrol. This also has been impacted negatively by the budget because we could not recruit any reserve force members for them, and at times because of other issues like serviceability of their vessels. Next slide. A military health airborne, for instance, for military health services, all services need to be supported everywhere where the Defense Force deploys. The health element must be there. So for the Air Force, it will be the health airborne. For the Navy, it will be marine related. For the Army, landed and capability. And this has been a struggle for Surgeon General as well, because of the same reasons that we have not been recruiting any reserve force members. And in some instances, the ones that we have, we cannot maintain because of budgetary constraints as well. Next slide. This is the strength of the reserves divided into race and gender. Army being the biggest service and the biggest utilizer of the reserves. They have 11,806, followed by the Air Force at 624, the Navy 612, SAMs at more than 2,000. Like I've already mentioned that they have nurses and doctors, especially when we had to deal with the pandemic. SAMs had to call up almost all their retired nurses that were available at the time. If you look at the male and female ratio, it is not what it should be. And it's difficult to change it in any direction, because if you don't recruit, then you can't change the status quo. Hoping that this picture will look different, because now we have a plan for the next 3 years, medium-term expenditure framework to recruit 1,000 reserve force members a year. And this in turn will increase our cost of employment, and it will also further increase our irregular expenditure. Next slide. This, as I have stated, is the average age of the reserves depicted in service and division, because reserve force members are utilized throughout the department, not only by the force services. They are only recruited through the force services, but the utilization happens across the board. For instance, with Secretariat, most of the finance accountant retired, and some of those were demilitarized soldiers, because in the past, our finance officials were soldiers, then they were demilitarized, and they became civilians. When most of them retired, there was a moratorium in the public service when it comes to advertisement and employment of Personnel Service Act personnel. So finance, the chief of finance resorted to calling up the retired members as reserves, because there was still a requirement, and we were now experiencing backlog when it comes to our finance division. So they had to call up those retired members and utilize them as reserves. Also in the Chief Director Strategic and Policy section under the SANDF, when there is a requirement because of structural deficiencies, they also call up some of our retired members as reserves and utilize them. Military ombuds has also called up retired lawyers and utilize them to assist with the military ombuds function. Department of Military Veterans also uses reserves. Almost all entities in the department, they utilize the reserves. As you can see, the average age there is now 49. It has risen from age 45 in the past 5 years. And this is as a result that we have not recruited any reserve force members. Next slide. This is the utilization according to statistics, number of days that we have called up reserves, and the amount that it has cost us to call up these reserves from the financial year 2015 to the current year. As you can see in those yellow blocks, in the fifth column, it is indicated. If you see the first top one, in the past we utilized 2,679,142 days. but the allocation was 2.6. But in all the years, we exceeded them. But because we are experiencing a deficit in the cost of employment, we took a decision to reduce the number of days to 2.6 to 1.9, even though we could see that the requirement has always been above 2.6. And if you see the actual days that we utilize year to date, you see that we've exceeded to almost 3 million, even though the decision was taken to reduce those number of days, because what is allocated does not match the department's requirement. And had we not done that, the Defence Force would have not been able to deploy in some of the operations that we instructed to deploy in, because we were compelled to augment the regular forces with the reserve force members, even though we did not have sufficient budget based on the man-day reduction. So the second last column indicates the number of days that we exceeded the man-day usage of the reserve force, while the last column indicates the amount in rents that we've actually utilized, which is 1,565,408 and 508. So when it comes to utilization of the reserves, we've always exceeded what the man-days that has been allocated, because there is always a requirement for the reserve force to augment regular force members and assist with structural deficiencies in other environment, as this slide explains and depicts. Next slide. This slide indicates the use of the reserves in the department, operational deployments in peace support operation and borderline control, mainly borderline control, because we have not deployed our reserve force members that much externally. I think the figure is standing now with external deployment of the reserve at less than 3%, but when it comes to border control, it's almost at 50%. So we would not manage to safeguard our borders without the reserves. They also render guard services to our institutions throughout the department. At the Department of Military Veterans, the guards there are reserved, and in most of other entities, except for army units where soldiers can really guard their units. But when it comes to other entities, they rely on reserves to guard the institutions of the department. They also render administrative services and other critical functions, like I've already mentioned, where we had our accountant retiring, but we could not advertise posts or employ their successors. Reserve force members were utilized. In the strategic environment under the Secretary of Defense Force, when there are gaps, they also call up reserves to close those gaps. They also render medical assistance to deployed forces. Like I've said earlier, anywhere where you deploy, you have to have your health element. So in some instances, this has to be enhanced by calling up reserves because there is not sufficient one with military health services. They render medical health services to other state departments in case of emergencies and disaster. One example that I can make here, in our public health institutions, when there are strikes, then they call up our soldiers to come and assist because we're an essential service. We don't participate in strikes. So every time there is a health problem, then we are called up and we use our reserves to play this role. Disasters as well, because most of our internal operations, we have to be augmented by the reserves. Otherwise, we will not be able to deploy internally if we had not have the reserve force component. For disaster relief through Operation Chariot, when there are floods, our reserve force members mostly are the ones that we deploy to augment the regular force members in such operations. For national and rural development, we used to have Project Kubatlala that was meant to assist with localized procurement, where, for instance, we would encourage our bases to make use of small and medium enterprises in areas where they reside, to make sure that we assist with the development of those areas instead of using big institutions. So with that, we had this project, but this project was solely concentrating on food and agricultural functions. With the current chief, this project Kubatlala has now evolved into a production brigade where we are planning to have a brigade that will be able to sustain the Defence Force with any production-related matter, including making of our own uniforms, so that we become a self-sufficient Defence Forces, because that's how most Defence Forces operate. They are able to produce any item that they require. So this is what the department is now aiming for. With the Defence Works formation, we all know in 2016-17, the functions where the Department of Public Works was maintaining the facilities of the department was given over to the department with the budget. And we expected Defence Works formation to be the one who performs this function. However, currently they don't have sufficient capacity because Defence Works formation started as a virtual structure. What we are now doing is to reskill the Reserve Force members on the requirement that we have in maintaining our facilities and make sure that we capacitate Defence Works formation in this function. Next slide. The budget here, the budget of the Reserve Force members, we don't have sufficient man days being the number of days that we use to utilize the reserves, because as a result of us being compelled to manage cost of employment that is in deficit, we had to reduce the number of days that we call up the reserves by 25% from 2.6 to 1.9, but the actual requirement, we even we used more than the 2.6 that we had originally. The reskilling of the reserves, which is continuous, and I've already spoken to, is that we would like to convert our unemployed Reserve Force members to people that can have a civilian job, alternative civilian job. But this is a struggle in our country because we all know the biggest unemployment in our country is the structural one, where people possess the skills that do not match the labor requirement. And most of our Reserve Force members don't have the sufficient skills to compete in the labor market. Hence, now we continuously reskilling them, not only for them to obtain alternative employment, or maybe for them to have a skill that they can live on, skills like construction, tiling, water purification, where one can just have their corner shop of water and sell water, because throughout the country now people buy water. If you have construction skill, you can have a skill that you can use for your own livelihood when you are not called up, to avoid having these members that are military trained that will be sitting idle when they are not called up, as that can have unintended consequences and impose a security risk to our own country. Job placement remains a challenge because of the reasons that I've already mentioned. It's employment, it's just a problem when it comes to Reserve Force members. The incentives for members to remain reserves is that there are educational bursaries in the department. However, this has become a problem as well because of budgetary constraints, because according to the study policy, when a member is studying, then they have to be called up and utilized for the number of years or months that they are getting that bursary. So this becomes a problem for services because they will be saying, we're struggling with many days to utilize them. So how are we going to afford to call them up, provide them with educational bursaries where they will not be available for utilization, and will now might have to pay them for the duration of the whole month that we cannot afford? The employer incentives, this we have benchmarked in 2015, where the visit with the Netherlands, where we were benchmarking these employer incentives, trying to find out how do we improve it in how we manage our own reserves. When we went to America as well, we discussed how they're doing this. We are aware of how it should be done, is that other militaries have relationships with the industries, that when you have vacancies, you first come to us and you take our Reserve Force members and you employ them. And it works in those countries because they believe that if you get a Reserve Force member, you get a person that is sufficiently trained and has discipline. However, in our country, like I've said, the problem is structural unemployment. Our Reserve Force members find themselves not being able to compete in the labor market. Hence, the continuous reskilling that we're embarking on as the department. Next slide. The problem that we've had in the last 5 years, because we have not recruited any reserve force members, is that the reserve force component has become an aging component with an average age of 49, where in some instances we are compelled to deploy older reserves. In the past, we used to have a military skills development system that we still have, but services would recruit more than the number that is required based on their attrition. Then at the end of the 2 years military skills development, all those members that were not provided with a core service contract then will be enlisted as reserve. However, in the last 3 to 4 years, services are now only recruiting according to their attrition. So there are no excess MSDS members that can be enlisted as the reserve and assist in rejuvenating this component. And at the same time, there has not been any reserve recruitment. So that is why the average age of the reserve just continued to rise unabated to a point where it's at now almost 50. It was decided in the work session that we have of the Chief of the South African National Defence Force, General Maphanya and Overbeck, that now we need to have a second stream of recruitment for the reserves. We decided that we're going to recruit 1,000 reserves for the next 3 years. However, it should be noted that this will increase our deficit on cost of employment, because when you recruit more people, you have to train them and you have to pay them salaries. So our deficit in the cost of employment will also increase as a result of this, and eventually our irregular expenditure that comes with us having deficit on our cost of employment will increase as well. The consequences of having an aging force, that is a reserve force component, is that the tempo of deployments will not be maintained when you have older reserves, because the ideal age for deployment is that you should not deploy people who are older than 50. However, in the past, we've been doing this because we no longer have younger reserve force members, and that has been seen in the average age of the reserve force member that has been continuing to rise. And also they will not be able to sufficiently play their role, that of augmenting their regulars, because of them being an aging reserve force component. And this has an adverse impact on the transformation of the reserves as well, because the current reserve force members we have, some of them are those that were inherited from our past, and we can't now recruit the younger ones to make sure that we change this picture. Next slide. Insufficient main days for continuation training. I think I've touched on this. Most services, they always playing a balancing act, that if I call up reserve force members, I don't have sufficient main days to train them, because I'm calling them up for utilization because there's a gap in the regular force members. However, now we've taken a policy decision that all services in all their training, they must have 10% representativity of reserves. The Army has been doing this. Other services are still struggling with it because of budget. Continuation training is essential to enhance and ensure combat readiness. Like I've already said earlier, if we're saying we fight as we train, then we cannot afford to have reserve force members who don't have the same level of training as those of their regular force counterparts, because when we deploy them, we deploy together as the South African National Defence Force, not as regulars and reserves. So if the training is not the same, it will compromise our operations and it will show, and this is a sort of a security risk. There are limited funds for leader group development. Like I've stated, an example of the university training program that would assist us to professionalize the military. There are no funds for it. It has not been happening because of funds. Funding for effective training and utilization of reserves is required. Currently, we've taken a decision to recruit, but still there are no funds. Hence, I said, now that we are going to recruit and train 1,000 reserves every year for the next 3 years, it is going to increase our cost of employment and in turn increase our irregular expenditure. But now we feel our backs are against the wall. We have no choice. If we don't start recruiting now, in the next 5 years, we will have no reserve force component. Next slide. The requirement for rejuvenation. Our numbers of our reserve force members have been declining over the years. However, the audit commitments where we have to utilize the reserves have been increasing. And this is the problem in the department, even with the regular force members, is that the number of our soldiers are reducing, but the commitments where we have to employ these soldiers are increasing. The average age of the reserves, like it has been depicted in the previous slides, is currently standing at 49 from 45 in the past 5 years. And this impacts on combat readiness, because if you strictly adhere to concurrent health assessments that we do before members are deployed, as members are getting older, then they develop all sorts of ailments that render them not combat ready. If you look at what the SHA requires, then we will end up with the majority of reserve force members that are not combat ready if we don't act now and recruit younger reserves. Our reserve force members form 25% of the total strength meaning the Secretariat and the South African National Defence Force. As I've stated earlier, our reserve force members are also utilized in the Secretariat, in fact, in all entities, including the Department of Military Veterans and Military Ombuds. So there are only 25% of that. If you only take into consideration the South African National Defence Force, there are only 22%, which we're aiming for a policy position of 30%, which is still lower to the international norm of 40%. If one can look at all the conflicts that are happening around the globe currently, most of those countries will not still be able to sustain those engagements had they not had sufficient reserve force components. Chief Joint Operation requires 50% of internal deployments to be reserve force members. We almost have that in Operation Corona at 46 because it varies. It depends on the rotation. In some rotation, you'll find that we have 49%. Operation Prosper, that forms part of all our internal operations, they're standing at 79%. So you can see most of the people that create stability internally are reserve force members, because for ESCOM, we have 462, legal mining, more than 50%. For external deployments, like I said earlier, it's at almost 3%, but internally, without our reserve force members, we will not be able to provide any stability for the country. Next slide. There is a need for a separate reserve force intake. That decision has been taken by our chief. The actual need for the army was actually 3,000. Army required 3,000 a year, only for them to be able to say now we are at a position where we are comfortable with our reserve force component. However, the department could not afford that. So the decision was taken that we will recruit 1,000 members for the medium-term expenditure framework, meaning the next 3 years. And we have taken a decision that we will use, when it comes to allocation, a decision of 6-to-1-1, where the Army gets 60% of that number because they are the biggest service, and the Air Force will get 20% of that number, and the Navy and SAMS respectfully share 10% of that number each, meaning the Army will recruit 600 members for the reserves, the Air Force 200, the Navy and SAMS respectively will recruit 100 members each. Next slide. The recruitment process and the way forward for the reserve force members, we are planning to decentralize this recruitment through our reserve force units that we have, especially in the Army. They have reserve force units throughout the country in different provinces. However, where there are no reserve force units like the Air Force, I know the Air Force currently does not have reserve force units. However, they have stations in different provinces. They can use those to recruit their own reserve force members based on the requirement that different services we will have. Then we will advertise this in the particular areas so that we make sure that we have reserve force members that belong that particular area. This will be important, especially from Mzansi Home Guard, because if we want to use them for intelligence to support operation, it's better to have people that are familiar with that particular area. Our target group, the age will differ. According to Personnel Management Code of the Defence Force and the regulations and the Defence Act, services can recruit reserves up to the age of 59. like I've said earlier, it depends on the requirement. For instance, if SAMS requires a surgeon, then an age will not be a problem in that instance. However, for the Army, if you want to recruit reserves that are going to rejuvenate and support members who are deployed in the borders, then you would want younger members. So the service will decide the requirement that they want to recruit for, and that will in turn determine the age in which they prefer to recruit their reserve force members for. The minimum requirement for anyone to join the military, whether it's a regular or reserve, is that you must have a matric certificate. Also, as we know, our country has many unemployed graduates. Depending on different requirements, we'll be recruiting those as well. The first step when the reserve force members are recruited is that they must be trained, basic military training to become soldiers. And we will use a formula that is similar to that of chaplains. They've been using it in the past because chaplains are regarded as professionals. Human resource acquisition will be involved in this process. The proposed allocation I've already stated according to different services. Next slide. The way forward, recruitment process, training and development. Like I've said, the first step when you get into the defense force is that you must be trained as a soldier, basic military training. Then you'll be trained on the function that you're going to be utilized in. For instance, if you're going to be an infantry soldier, then you'll go to infantry school and be trained. And then there's a continuation training that you provide to your reserve force members to make sure that they remain combat ready. Like we said earlier, that the security threat can emanate in 24 hours. So that is why your forces must always remain combat ready, because there's no time to train them when we have to utilize them. That is why continuously we have to continue training them, and maybe through exercises still ascertain if they are still fit for purpose, hence the continuation training. The leader group development for young officers through URTP and other processes. We aim to continue with this, but affordability remains a factor. Include reserve training at nodal points and centers of excellence. We have different centers of excellence, the Defense Force, so the reserve training will also be incorporated there. Like I've said earlier, we currently do not have a specific policy position as to what component of our force should be reserve. What we are proposing is that we should have 30% reserve force component of the total force. Align the reserve force with force design and review the reserve force service system to fit into the journey to greatness, which is the grand plan of the DOD. We are writing this chapter to include it there for our reserve force members. The utilization is stated in the reserve force utilization, where it gives you different categories where reserve force members can be used and how to formulate the contract of the reserve. Next slide. In conclusion, throughout this presentation, I think it has been depicted visibly that for all our internal operations, if you look at the statistics that I presented earlier, could not have taken place without our regular force members being augmented by the reserves. An example of this was managing the pandemic, internal and external disasters that we employ our members for, relief operations and ongoing support to the South African police services when we are required to do so, has proven that the military, our military South African National Defense Force, will not be able to conduct any of these internal operations without them being augmented by the reserve force component. So that is why it is important for the department to ensure that we maintain this component as a viable component that will be able to play its role of supporting the Defense Force in all their ordered commitments, deployments, and operations. Thank you. That concludes my presentation, sir.
Thank you very much. We will now, good. Yes, we will now take hands for those who want to get into Honorable Ninghouse.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the SANDF and the two presenters for the very extensive presentations that we have received. I must say that my overall conclusion on these presentations is that the Reserve Force is a force that is in crisis. I suppose we should not be surprised by that, because that reflects also the general state that the South African National Defence Force is in. Under those circumstances, I want to ask some questions of General Yekulu with regards to his presentation. He said that there had been a process of nomination for members of the Defence Force Council, and that that process has been concluded. I would like to find out what were the criteria and what was done in terms of making sure that that process complies, who actually were eligible to be nominated, was this widely known throughout the country, and was there an optimization of making sure that all of those who are indeed capable and eligible to be nominated were aware of this and could be nominated. Slide 10 in his presentation emphasized the importance of representativity, and I would like to know whether that has indeed happened. Then I understand that he's now busy with the process of selection, which will be presented to the minister. And once again, the issue that arises is whether the nomination process was adequate, and therefore whether the process of selection will indeed comply with the criteria. Moving on to the second presentation, Honorable Chair, I think it is a serious matter of concern whether the South African Reserve Service, Defence Force Reserves, can indeed deal with the issues that it is supposed to do, can indeed provide the service. The age that we are given as 49 is really very disconcerting. And I'm also not confident, on the basis of the presentation that we have received, that there is a proper continuation of training and therefore maintaining the capability of our reserve force. Under those circumstances, the role that is expected of the reserve force is certainly not going to be able to be complied with. And this is going to even further weaken the capability of the SANDF in general. So we cannot have the current age profile. It is really akin to us moving in the direction of an old age home. And evidently, therefore, the service that the Reserve Force has to provide will not be provided. I'm also concerned, Chair, that this age profile indicate to me that we do not see a process of renewal within the SANDF, and that the Reserve Force is most likely to reflect some of the problems that we can expect to have from the old SADF and the old Homeland Forces, which I suspect, and I would like to get clarity about this, will be predominant in the Reserve Force because of the age profile and because of the fact that apparently there's been no ability to recruit new intakes into the Reserve Force. Chair, I would like to land there, and hopefully I will get an opportunity on the basis of the responses that we have received to then also ask follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hala.
Good morning. Thanks, Honorable Chair. Good morning, honorable members and generals. Chair, you'll pardon me if I'm the one who's making a mistake. On introduction and background, I think is the first line, August 1992. But component of, is it not supposed to be SADF instead of SANDF? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Hattie.
Chair, thank you. If you would perhaps excuse me for not using my video. I'm struggling with bandwidth where I am. I've got questions on the also on the Reserve Force Council. Also expanding on what Honorable Neo has said on slide 6, the general referred to election process, and then later on slide 11 referred to nominations, and then it's apparently the chair, the general, that will decide. Now, I would like to know, you have the criteria, and if we get 200, 300 or so nominations, how will the general then decide which shortlist he will give to the minister? I would like to understand that, and then I would like also to understand how, in terms of slide 6, how were elections, what exactly is meant by the elections, and how is this advertised, how wide? Then if we get into the SANDF Reserve Force, first my question, and I must say this, apart from the aging force that we have and the declining numbers, there's also a number of issues that are concerning. For instance, the number of years that there was no Reserve Force Council. And then also that we know that General Roy Anderson retired in 2021. It's now 2025. I would like to know what happened in the period between 2021 and 2025, and why do we have now an acting Chief of Defence Force Reserve? What is exactly going on there? I also see, and even the Defence Force Council have got very ambitious plans, and for instance, having an obstacle course. Obstacle course for 50-year-olds, it's got to be a special one to accommodate them. If we want to send 50 or 49 is the average, so many of them that are now much older. And next year, I believe the average age will, with the limited resources that we have, and the lack of a clear plan, how we are going to grow our reserve force. Next year, the average will be 50, and with, again, 10% less number. So I would like to know, how do we see a proper plan on the table, properly funded, because it's clear that the Defence Force Reserve is in a downward spiral. And if it's not properly funded, if there's not a continuous feeding of the reserve force, of all the different disciplines that the requirements are, it was listed there, then there is no future for a SANDF Reserve Force, and all the ambitions, all the dreams of using reserve force members to in deployments actually is just a dream. It will not happen. Now, we can visit all the countries in the world, apart from the Netherlands and in the United States, and spend a lot of money on that. If we don't have a basic plan how we're going to do it, just form the basis of the pyramid that we want to build, then, well, we are wasting our time. there is no review of the 2015 defense review. There's an overdue reassessment of that, which still remains a tightly guarded secret. But I would like to know exactly if I don't know whether this reassessment was actually shared with the Defence Force Reserve Command, but I would like to know that. Perhaps we get the answers in that. So, Chair, I would like to know the tangible futures, not what we are going to do, plans on the table, what has been done to address this crisis about the Defence Reserve Force. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Shelembe.
Chair, I'm not hearing anything. Is it just me or is it all of us?
No, Honorable Shelembe's hand was up, but I see it's been dropped. And he also seems to have left the meeting. I don't know whether he's struggling to connect. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chair. It's fine.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So we can continue to Honorable.
Sorry, Chair. He left the meeting, but he just joined now, Chair. He has rejoined.
Let's take Honorable Plakis for now to allow Honorable Shelembe to settle. Honorable Plakis.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, mine is just on the rejuvenating of the reserve force. The presentation say they are going to recruit about 3,000 new reservists, and I don't see a proper plan on how they are going to go about it. I will just want maybe for them to elaborate on that. How are they going to go about that 3,000 recruitment of new reservists? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Shelembe.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Sorry, I just got disconnected. I don't know what happened. Chairperson, though I don't have much questions, but more of the comments. You know, one must agree that, life comes first. Now, if you speak of our reserve force and if we are saying we are taking care of them, I'm worried if we say the department cannot afford to give enough, man days for them to be well capacitated, so that when they are requested to be deployed somewhere, at least, they are. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, as I'm saying, my concern is that these reserve, force members are requested to, they are deployed especially to unrest areas where their life is at risk. And they are deployed, in like I say, like Operation Corona, as same like Operation Prosper. Now, how confident we are that when they go there, they can do the job properly because of the capacitation. But the answer from the presentation is that they are forced to reduce the number of man days to ensure that they are well capacitated. Now, another thing I want to know from the department, because always when they do the budgeting, it's like the cut and paste, taking the budget from the previous year to another financial year. Why the department is not working on what we call like a zero budgeting or reprioritizing? If I say reprioritizing, I'm referring to a situation where you want to deploy a reserve force that is not well capacitated, and then you do not, help. On the other side, vehicle that is at 3 million or 2 million or 4 million for one person. When is it possible that maybe one day the department is giving us, the line items of these votes and is going to, so you can see that maybe some of the priorities at the time are no longer relevant now, and then the money can be used, for our soldiers. And the question that I have, if our reserve force are deployed, say they get killed, are they getting the same benefit like a regular force member when, they are dying or whatever happened while at work? I will be happy to know that, because maybe their rights need also to be looked at as well. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Seeing as there are no hands at the moment, I will invite General Yekelo and Honorable No.
Sorry, Chair. I was using two devices. I didn't realize that when I transferred to the other, my name was down. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation, the Minister and General and everybody else on board. Chair, taking everything into account on the comments and questions that have been made, I think this presentation gives us a chance as a committee looking at this component within defense, which I regard it to be very important, looking at the presentation. It still gives us another chance to go back and unpack this report and come up with clear recommendations where we think the component needs to be strengthened further around the planning and the execution and the role that they play. However, I just want to ask this question, Chair, whether this is one area that could be looked into maybe for the comment. One is the impression of the Minister since he came in and took over and has looked at all the components, but specifically this one around the strengthening of the defense force and the role that it plays extensively beyond the main operation of the defense force. Secondly, Chair, we've got a whole range of unemployed school leavers, call them in whatever needs, yaupis and what have you. Is there a role within in which we the reserve force can be utilized to play a role at the very early stage, even if it's schools or somehow, where we can begin to streamline young people who are just roaming out there and find a way, even up to working with the traditional leaders right at the ground, to make sure that we play a role in terms of eliminating future criminals who do not have anything to do if they are not going to school. I see somehow a role of the component. Lastly, on slide 9, Chair, where there is a categorization of races, the last one, it says unknown. Just got worried. If you have got people within there, others you are able to categorize in terms of their race, but the others you say unknown. What does that supposed to mean? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can we get responses now? The Minister wants to go first.
No, Chair, I'm not responding. I'm just wanting to make a comment to say,
yes,
remind ourselves that the reserve force is not your main force. You know, in all professions, there are reserve workers. For instance, in the police, we have people who volunteer and the reserves there, and then they are compensated. Even in education, we used to have a list of teachers that we call upon. If one teacher falls pregnant, we bring them on board for 3 months or so. What complicates matters here is that the high unemployment, so that your volunteers are normally your job seekers. So then you end up with somewhat a parallel process of employing people that you need as and when you need them. And sometimes it's young people, whereas international, the trend is that people who are on reserves, it's people who are employed elsewhere, it's people who volunteer, it's people who are skilled in that area. As I say, teachers would have been your retired teachers or just volunteers who come and you compensate them for the time. We have a strong defense force of 65,000 people. That's our main defense force. So that all things like recruitment of young people, benefits, they'll mainly happen there. But here, because we have people that use us as when we need them, as a different category of people who come as and when, we want to regularize and assist them as much as possible. So I thought Chair should highlight that we're not speaking about our regular. So all things of recruitment, when we recruit 10,000 soldiers, for instance, when we recruit, which is the annual recruitment, it's people who are between 19 years. And I was shocked that in the defense, if you're after 25 years, they don't take you. So which means you have complete fresh intake on that side of your main defense force. And on this other side will be people that are there. And I think rightfully, Chair, even people that are job seeking, they were retired people, they were trained people who could not make it in the defense force, to create opportunities for them. And as and when you find space, you identify them. So it's not anything different from your usual reserve forces in health, in education. In health, when they wanted, during Corona, they went to call the list of nurses that they have who are not in their regular employ. I thought I should raise that, Chair, as I think should be part of the considerations in considering matters of the reserve force. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Can we also then get responses from the rest of the team?
Chairperson, thank you very much. And let me thank the honorable members for the contributions into this presentation. I need to start off, Chair. I didn't in the beginning, my mistake was to introduce the Chief of Human Resources that is sitting with me. We are in the same room, that is Lieutenant General Chongai. And allow me, Chair, to say the following before I allow the colleagues to close the gaps. I need to say, once the Department of Defense has called in any reserve force member into its system for the purposes of them being employed in the various ways which the presentation has shown, they are now part of us. What it means is that we do not have a budget directed to say this is a reserve force budget, except for their payment, for their salaries. There we are specific, hence we talk about mandates. Any other thing, they are part of us. It could be training, it could be deployment, it could be whatever duties that they are supposed to do in their capacity. They are part of us, and they are entitled to everything which, as a permanent force member, I am entitled to. That I thought I need to bring out this point. There have been a number of questions that were asked. So we do not look at the reserve force in isolation of any budgetary planning. They are part of us. Now, let me say, start with the reason, the age that is being mentioned. You know, in the Defence Force, Chairperson, we have been doing recruitments which were initially directed to be members of the regular force. And you would have heard what General Yekelo was saying in terms of the streams for the recruitment of the reserves. But they were regular force after we changed from certain systems that were there. Them being members of the regular force, Chair, as we recruit, in each and every recruitment per year, we could not meet the natural attrition of the Defence Force. Now, you can imagine if there was, we had a drastic reduction in terms of the total manpower. However, those people who leave the Defence Force, we were putting them and encouraging them to join the reserves. There are exceptions in a person having to join the reserve. You don't just because you are leaving or you are fired from the Defence Force, then you join the reserve. No. If you are fired from the reserve force, that means that from the regular force, it means the Defence Force will actually not need your service, even in the reserve force. So what then we have, Chairperson, it's a situation that I think Honorable Niehaus mentioned the fact that the state of the DoD as is cannot be differentiated from that of the reserves. It's because we are one in any way that we are applying our things. Now, I want to link this with a question that says that. So I'm saying dealing with the average age of a soldier, and we are linking it just to the reserve force, is let's go and check in terms of the regulars. We might be lucky in terms of the average age of the reserves, of the regulars, because we do have intake, although we are not meeting up in terms of the attrition that has been there. Hence, we then took a decision now to say we need to up the game in terms of the intakes. And this is an effort. It answers to some of the questions. It's an effort which Chief Human Resource is fully engaged in. National Treasury are aware. We've made this point to the committee to say, we want to make a change in terms of the intakes of the Defence Force, the younger recruits. And it is to make up in both the regulars and the reserves to beat in terms of the age. That is obviously, you want the soldiers to be running. And there is a certain age limit where they cannot be running. But let me say this. You would have seen we are saying 50% of them are deployed internally. Now, as 50% of them are deployed internally, a 49-year-old is deployed in border safeguarding. A 49-year-old is deployed in managing the ESCOM facilities, is deployed in illegal mining. In fact, the age that is beyond that is deployed internally in internal operations for them to be able to do what they are supposed to do. And if we say, because of the finances, are they going to be able, they do when they are called up. When we call up the reserve, there's a process that we do. And it happens even in the regulars. So what we do to the regulars once the reserve have been called up is the same thing that we do. If we are doing combat readiness training, the reserves are also part of the combat readiness training. They are not excluded. So they join, they do the combat readiness training, complete it, and then they are deployed wherever they must be deployed. We do accept sometimes, especially with internal operations, that is where now, and we don't want to say we are so perfect in that, because when you call the people and it's in an agent operations, when they come in, there might not be sufficient time for you to do the training that you are supposed to do. But obviously, we go and review that. When was the last time that you did your concurrent health assessment? And we check all other things. By the way, in terms of your training, where do you stand? It takes a bit of time and it's a bit painful, but it is worth doing than not doing anything at all about that. So I'm bringing these issues just so that we understand that the problem that is there, it is not a problem that is facing just the reserve force. As we say, let us rejuvenate the whole defense force. That's what we mean. In terms of training, for career development of the reserves, they are taken care of in terms of career development for the reserves. What the presenter said, we allow 10% within the reserve force for them to be part of the regular force intakes in any kind of training. You start from our defense college, senior command and staff, they are there. You start at the defense college, at the National War College, they are there. And down lower to the other ranks. They are there, but the presenter did mention that in other services, they are struggling a bit. That struggle is because of the fact that in some senior ranks, the reserve force have got permanent force. If you take, for instance, within the military health, you are talking about people who would normally have their own specialties. If you talk about the Navy, if this person was a hydrographer, that person has already been taken somewhere. And therefore, then these are some of the things that we have, and we are managing this as we move on. Chairperson, I just to come to this point, I think it was mentioned by Honorable Hutching. He speaks about the fact that there's been a gap in terms of the intake of the acting chief defense reserve, of the chief of defense reserves. The chief of defense reserve is a reserve force officer. And I need to say that we've been trying. You will recall, I think prior to 2022 or somewhere there, 2022, we had a chief of defense reserve who had requested to end the service that he was there. Of course, the service was on a short-term basis to allow him to adjust. We don't want to give him a longer term because you've got to kind of do an assessment in terms of that. But then he requested that if he can be relieved. And that's how he left. So to appoint the chief of defense reserve must be a reserve force officer. That reserve force officer is not permanent with us. And therefore, what I can say to the honorable members is that the chief of the defense force has been trying to check the most appropriate candidate in this particular field. And what we could come to, thanks to the Minister of Defense, we could come to the chairperson of the Reserve Force Council. And the general did accept to say, yes, I'm ready and I am willing to do this work. That's where we are. So I want to say that it's not an area which we have allowed to lose. It's an area that we're still pursuing to say, but we need to get a candidate that can take the defense reserves much further into the future. And looking at somebody who wants to be a reserve, who wants to be a chief of the defense reserves for 1 year and promising maybe for 2 years, I don't think it's viable. We want something that's a bit in the longer term. We do say the people will be assessed, not that we are taking directly and putting them into the reserve force. I need to say to Honorable Pizzo, I think we take note of what you have said, Honorable Pizzo. I must confess, Chair, from there, I couldn't hear Honorable Pizzo except for what he said, the very first part, which he was making recommendations to say, maybe the presentation must be looked at and they must be packaged so that whatever answers that remains can be taken up by the committee for the committee to give feedback in terms of the proposals that the committee may want to make to us. And I think that is well accepted. Rejuvenation, Honorable Plaiki, of the 3,000. I think your observation, Honorable Plaiki, is spot on. Is the 3,000 in the MTEF period, meaning 1,000 every single year. That is what we will be doing. That is to make sure in the next MTEF we take 1,000. But like I said, Chief Human Resource is in discussion on these matters with National Treasury. I need to say, in rejuvenating the Defence Force, it's not going to be easy. And honorable members will understand why. When we talk about an intake of 10,000, people look at it and they look at 10,000 to be, and they begin to think the compensation of employees. How are we then going to, so it's not an easy thing to try and convince one another between ourselves and National Treasury. But that's the journey we must embark on. The reason why, as the Defence Force, we find ourselves where we are. So we need to do we're going to do our best to try and convince people to make sure that we capacitate the Defence Force. We are where we are because of doubt, and not saying let's move with this path so that we can have a viable and vibrant Defence Force. I need to say, Chairperson, if there are areas, I want to give my colleagues now to cover the areas that I may not have covered. General Yekelo, I left this area deliberately so because he has been a military officer for quite some time, and the rest of his life he's been a soldier, and I don't doubt that he will be able to respond to all this. General Yekelo, may I request you to respond on those issues that have been asked, and thereafter General Niabo will then add, and I'm sitting with General Chonga. He will indicate to me if he's got an appetite. But for now, he is still quiet. Chairperson, General, can I request through you, Chair, General Yekelo to respond? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Can I respond, Chair? Chair?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to turn on my volume. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members and honorable ministers and deputies. There's basically 3 members asked questions which directly are applicable to me. Let me just start with the first question, which was asked by Honorable Pala. It's about what's on my slide 4 with regards to SANDF or SANDF. Now, the way that is phrased, the bullet is phrased correctly, because as we look back, that part-time force discussion of the component of the SANDF was a futuristic discussion about what will happen after the formation of the new Defence Force, what will happen to the reserves. Will there be no reserves? Or if reserves will be there, what will be their status? So maybe it's unclear because maybe I made an assumption that's understandable. Those were discussions within the framework of the GMCC, which was discussing the future of South African Armed Forces. The next question were from Honorable Nias on the process of nomination and the criteria, nomination eligibility, and representativity. I will just draw the members' attention to the information brief that all should have, which in page 3 talks to the question of nomination and selection. That's right, yeah. This nomination and selection process is both covered directly in what perhaps I should have tagged it as one of the reference matters on the now what is a staatscourant? I'm sorry for this. I'm sort of stuck in English. What is it called now in English? What is reflected here is the staatscourant. It's the government gazette. Yeah. Apologies, Chair. Yeah, that's right. It's reflected as staatscourant of December 23 December 2016 number 40515. That's right, yeah. On the regulations of the Reserve Force Council in accordance with the Defence Act number 42 of 2002. The criteria for nomination is outlined there, clearly outlined. If I may just briefly state, for instance, it says that on the instruction of the minister, which is contemplated in regulations, the chairperson of the council must, within 90 days of receipt of the minister's instruction, invite constituent associations and structural components to nominate candidates. That's right. This was the process that we followed to nominate through this process. Now, there are constituents. Some of these constituents will be what is called the from the Reserve Force, for instance, Reserve Force Association, and from the reserves, and any other qualified candidates as may be identified. Now we have to take cognizance of the fact, honorable members, that this new process now is beginning in a process where the minister is not kickstarting the nomination with an existing council in place. There's no existing council in place. So in order to reconstitute the council, she then nominated, appointed a chairperson, and as I said, also a secretariat, and instructed the chairperson to issue out nominations, which has been done to these constituents. As you will see, after the minister has considered the list and satisfied herself whether it does meet the criteria as prescribed, and whether the people have the competency, that's all right. You will see the list one. There are some members coming from the past council because they were members of the constituents of the council, that is the Reserve Force Association. That's all right. Some come from units, that's all right. And some are retired members from the force. So the criteria is very clear, including on the question of the representativity in terms of demographics and such. That's all right. Where I must state is that what I will be able to find out when we now have this initially approved number of members of the council, who must then kickstart the process of the reactivating the Reserve Force Council. What will then be able when we start that process, after the minister's decision, we'll be able to then go down and evaluate even the state of these associations, which in paragraph 12 of the information brief, page 3, are reversed. Reserve Force constituents, for instance, 54% of that. Reserve Force Council Association, 23% of that. That's all right. But let me also state that in the nomination and selection, which has been done, as far as I'm concerned, it has satisfied what I was fearful might happen. The Reserve Force Council, in my view, must lean towards understanding of defense, not just understanding of technical issues at the bottom, which would happen if we were to, for lack of a better word, English is not my first language, crowd the council, which is supposed to provide strategic advice, with people with a tactical perspective. That's all right. But the Reserve Force units will have representation within the council. That is for sure. But the rest of the nominated members, that's all right, will talk to the operational and strategic level of understanding of defense function and the whole broad defense environment. I hope I've sort of answered this particular question in this regard, but I'm open to being engaged. Then there was a question raised by Honorable Hatting about the election. I must apologize there that I had edited this out of the initial presentation that was drafted. And I stuck with what is even in the info brief, nomination and selection. That's right, because the question then of election, in my view, as I read the Constitution, and that would have applied if this process was being handled on behalf of a minister by a properly constituted Reserve Force Council, which is not available, which is not the case now. That's all right. So we stuck to drawing from the regulations and from the Constitution what is visible now, which is nomination, and then having been nominated and looked at all whether these people who have been nominated, that's all right, or volunteered and got nominated by various constituents, then when we then select, we look at that criteria. The criteria will be submitted to the minister, including the profiles of these names that will be there. These will be people with profiles and all of that. I hope I've answered the questions, Chair, but as I'm saying, I may address any follow-up question in this regard.
Yes, thank you very much. Is there anyone, Brigadier General Niabomana, do you also want to answer anything, or do you think you've been sufficiently covered?
Thank you, sir. The Chief of Staff almost sufficiently covered the questions that were directed to me, sir. But maybe just the last point to confirm to the members of the committee that the Reserve Force members, their training is sufficient. They have the capacity. The only thing I was explaining, if you see that we were compelled to reduce the number of man days from 2.6 to 1.9, whereas the actual utilization has always gone beyond 3 million. So I was trying to explain the continuous and constant over expenditure when it comes to Reserve Force salaries, because when they are called up and there are additional audit commitments, they have to be trained, and we have to provide them with continuation training. So they are in par with their regular force component. The capacity is not compromised. However, I was just trying to explain the continuous over expenditure when it comes to Reserve Force wages. That in turn puts more pressure on the cost of employment. And then at the end of every financial year, we have to explain irregular expenditure. That is the problem faced by the department currently. Anything that involves salary of members, it increases our cost of employment, increases our deficit, and it increases our irregular expenditure. That is the challenge that we're continuously struggling with over the years. That's just the part I wanted to explain. So I think the Chief of Staff covered everything, unless there is something that the committee might want me to speak on. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Do we have any follow-up questions? Honorable members, Mr. Niehaus?
Yes, Chair.
Mr. No.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Chair. Maybe the General or the support staff didn't hear me very well. I asked about the slide 9 of the second presentation, where it makes reference to unknown members within the Reserve Force, because it is under the categorization of races. I don't know if maybe that is not that much of importance, but to me, it's like you have people that you don't know their origin within your staff. But I also ask, maybe this is a matter that we will deal with going forward about the trend where we within the society that as the minister has explained. I'll leave that one, but I just want to an answer on that one of the categorization of the unknown. Thank you.
Your network doesn't sound very stable, and I was struggling to hear you towards the end, but I hope that the Chief of Staff and the Chair of the Reserve Force Council heard you. Can we take Honorable Niehaus?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I want to thank the Chief of the SANDF for what I think was a very useful input from his side, because he helped us to understand that we must see the Reserve Force in the full context of the SANDF, both in terms of the challenges and the problems that it is faced with, but I think more importantly, in terms of the rigors of what is expected of members of the Reserve Force in terms of their service. And this is where I have a problem and I want clarity. I really didn't understand the common sense comment by the minister. In fact, I think sometimes common sense, as applied in this particular instance, is quite dangerous. Because the way in which the Chief of Staff of the SANDF explained the situation, he made it clear that the Reserve Force is not a spare tire. It is an integral component of the SANDF. And furthermore, I don't think we can make the comparison that the minister made between Reserve Force members as soldiers and reserve teachers. Very different things are expected from Reserve Force soldiers. And the fact that they need to have the physical training, that they need to have the ability to carry out very dangerous duties, makes that situation very different. Because we have learned from this presentation that internal deployments, especially where we deal also with security issues, ESCOM, the combating of illegal miners, etc., we have a 50% plus deployment of Reserve Force members. So this is indeed a very different rigor that is expected. And I think we need to take that into consideration, because the comment by the minister made me very worried, because I think it is a misconception, a misunderstanding of what the role of the Reserve Force is and its truly integrated role within the South African National Defence Force. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any other contributions or comments? I think we can clarify slide or general Olomisa.
No. Yeah, that's out to bye-bye.
Okay. No. You are excused. You are excused, Deputy Minister.
I thought you are closing the show.
No. We're not yet.
Okay. I'll wait then.
Now, there was an issue raised by Honorable Noe about slide 9. Can Brigadier General Niabo Mana please clarify slide 9?
Thank you, sir. Slide 9, where we stated the unknowns. We were auditing the number of Reserve Force members that we have, because in 2021, there was a complaint from Chief Army that he's always been told that he has this number of Reserve Force members. But when he wanted to call them up to assist with stabilizing the country during the unrest, he could not find all the number of reserves that he was told he had. So we had to clean up the system. Whilst cleaning up the system, meaning putting those members that we can no longer call because of age on National Archive, or those who have not called for the past 5 years, meaning that maybe there's no requirement for them, then we put them on National Archive. We had this number that we could not trace anywhere. Chances are that these members, some of them have passed on, or they are no longer interested to be Reserve Force members. However, according to the system, those we assumed have passed on, you cannot remove unless you have their death certificate. We had talks with Home Affairs, and they informed us that they cannot give us, even if they can ascertain that the person has passed on, if you're not a family member, you cannot get a member's death certificate. So in our system, when we calculate the number of reserves, trying to consolidate our statistics, we have this number that remains unknown because these people, we have not called them up in the past 5 years. We are not sure whether they still are interested in being reserve force members or if they are even still alive. That is why they are unknown currently, because we cannot confirm their status. And we cannot remove them from the system without having their death certificate if they have passed on. But this is a continuous project where we are trying to clean up the system. Eventually, we will get it right. So that is what the unknown means, sir. Not that we have current active reserve force members that we don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can end the discussion here. We want to thank you very much for your, I think, very frank engagement with the committee and frank submissions to the committee. We must also commend the Minister for prompt action taken to re-establish the Reserve Force Council by appointing the chair and starting the process of appointing members of the council, especially after the hiatus between 2022 and now. It's a welcome action. We look forward to meeting and engaging with the full complement of the council once established, and to being briefed as to how it's providing the requisite leadership to the reserve force. But the report presented to us highlights the need for the ongoing engagement with the presiding officers on the discussion on the state of the defense force, because the reserve force, from what we have been briefed, doesn't only deal with menial tasks. It is a crucial support service for the defense force, and the tasks which they perform are crucial to the successful execution of the mandate of the defense force. And so the undercutting of the budget, the cutting of the budget, the fact that the defense force and the reserve force in particular have to operate with a very, very paltry budget is a matter of grave concern to us. I must assure members that we continue to pursue the debate on the state of the defense force as was adopted by this committee and by the 6th committee in its report. And we hope that we will make progress eventually in that regard. But after this briefing, it's also quite clear that we need to look at the issue of the white paper, as well as in our future oversight visits, visiting some of the reserve force units to engage and experience firsthand the challenges which they are faced with. But we will obviously deal with those issues on an ongoing basis. For now, I want to thank the minister, the deputy ministers, as well as the team from the Defense Force and the Reserve Force that are here. You may now be excused. We will be dealing with internal issues of the committee. You are excused from the meeting. Honorable members, we will now go. When we adopted the agenda, we agreed to deal with the 2 issues after the minutes. So we will now take the minutes And since this is again a virtual meeting, we're going to deal with the minutes of the 7th of March. The minutes of the closed meeting, we will deal with them when we meet physically, so that we can ensure that they remain confidential as the closed meeting was. Can we proceed? Can we proceed with the minutes? Should I take the minutes as read?
Yeah, Chair, I think we should always take the minutes as read. We should read our minutes before we come to these meetings.
Do we have any comments on the minutes? If not, do we have a mover for the adoption of the minutes?
I will move, so Chair.
Honorable
Okay, Chair.
Martin.
I'll move again for concurring with the move for adoption by Mr. Hatton, so that I second it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We then move to the issue of the NCACC outstanding response. We wrote the follow-up letter, which was submitted, which was sent to the minister in the presidency who chairs the NCACC on Monday. I would like to suggest that since it was delivered on Monday, we give her time to consider our request and come back to us. Obviously, this being working day number 4 since we submitted the letter on Monday, we are going to follow up at the beginning of the new week on the response to our letter, after which I think we will try to escalate the issue so that we get the response, because the DCAC has had sufficient time to investigate the submission which was made to them and to respond to us. So on Tuesday next week, no, on Wednesday, that will be working day 7. We will then follow up with the minister and then escalate the matter further if we still do not have the response. Honorable Niehaus, I take you.
Thank you, Chair. I think you're extraordinarily generous in the light of the fact that these questions date back from much longer than the letter that you sent now more recently. But let's accept that ruling that you've made, and let's hope that the minister will respond. Unfortunately, Chair, there had been some further developments with regards to this issue. You will recall that our Secretariat mentioned that Mr. Mashaba, who's the Secretary at the DCAC, that is the structure that services the NCACC, sent her a reference to a newspaper article that appeared on Independent Online and said in the light of that, he is not responding or he doesn't see a need to respond. Now, Chair, this week, the independent newspaper group had been approached by attorneys of Rheinmetall Denel Munitions, expressing concerns about that article and reports about the issue of the problem of ammunition and weapons exporting from South Africa, reaching apartheid Israel through Hungary and through Germany, and also reaching the Ukraine. Chair, this is for me very disconcerting because I think we need to connect the dots. Mr. Mashaba sends an article that was published by IOL based on the events that took place in our meeting on the 29th of November, and immediately in the week thereafter, there is now a visit by lawyers with no other intention but to try and close down any reporting on this matter. And I think we should put on record, Chair, that we need to have all of these issues addressed, that it is unacceptable that Mr. Mashaba was not prepared to respond, but beyond that, it is really disconcerting that when Rhine Metal Denel Munitions is mentioned in a meeting of our joint standing committee, and one of our newspaper and media groups report on that they are then being put under pressure not to report what happens in our committee. The only conclusion I can draw from all of this, Chair, is where there is smoke, there is fire. And this situation, with the actions of Mr. Mashaba and also the subsequent actions taken by Rhine Metal, only emphasizes to me the urgency of the need for us to deal with this issue and to get the answers that we've requested, and to make it very clear that we will not allow ourselves to be disregarded and nor allow ourselves to have any action of us being silenced or intimidated. So please, Chair, that ruling of yours must be a hard one, that if we do not get a response from the minister by the time, the date that you had set, that we will move strongly on this issue, because this is now becoming a totally untenable situation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Hattie.
Chair, just to emphasize the importance of what's going on there, and we've heard that Honorable Niaz referred to where there's smoke. I think you may be aware of our attempt to do oversight at the DCIC, where we were actually banned from the building. The chief SANDF, with no role to play in the NCACC, actually came into the meeting and questioned us, and even demanded that we need a letter from the Minister of Defence for us to do oversight work. And then the director of the DCIC received a phone call from the minister, who happens to be chairperson of the NCACC, forbidding him to have any discussion with us. This is an untenable situation. We've been hearing rumors of the inaccessibility of the NCICC, the NCIC, or the DCIC, and we've even heard that money may be paid to expedite applications for export. Now, this is bad, and it's bad for our economy, and it's bad for job creation, it's bad for everything. And we need to get to the bottom of the secrecy and the veil of secrecy that hangs over this DCIC and the NCICC.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hattie. Look, I think what we should do, we will give them until Wednesday to respond. I will call the minister to remind her that we are awaiting a response. Then, in the meantime, we will seek advice as to what steps we should take as the committee should we not get a response to this question. Then the issues Mr. Hatton raises will be discussed with the minister when they present the first report of the NCACC. I think I will discuss with the co-chair and the members of the secretariat of the committee when we expect the NCACC to make a presentation to us, because the last meeting, which we converted from NCACC to DCAC, was at the request of the minister, which we understood because they had just met So when we meet, we will have a discussion about all of those issues. But the one that Mr. Niehaus had raised is a long outstanding issue. I think we will seek advice on what steps to take should we not get a response by Wednesday. In that case, we can proceed to the final issue, which was raised by the co-chair. I think I will let him co-chair it. It was the issue of the oversight visit. Now, the issue here is that we have been advised that our colleagues from the NCOP are not able to be part of the oversight visit, which has put our oversight program for the 24th to 28th in question, because it's not clear whether in their absence we can be able to proceed. But I don't know if Dr. van Rensburg and Oliver, if you are able to shed light and Nandip on the issue of the oversight visit. But I will hand over also to the co-chair to chair this session and close the meeting afterwards.
Yes, good morning, honorable members, and thank you very much, co-chair. Let me just speak about the issue of the oversight. Then I'll hand over back to you to close the meeting. Yes, I've spoken with the deputy chairs of chairs, Honorable Hadebe, about this matter. I also spoke to the NCOP chief whip about the matter, and he wanted a request which we have submitted to him. But there's a challenge here, honorable members, about the programming, that when the NA is on oversight, the NCOP has some problems in the chamber. That is an issue of programming, Chair, and I think that is the thing which must be resolved. I hope our support staff will forward it and will handle it. But as of now, the matter is with the chief whip. He promised that he will come back to us. He will look into it. But from the chairs of chairs, there was a concern that we cannot have plus minus 6 members of the NCOP not in plenary. So he was quite he spoke about it to say no, he cannot allow that. That number is a lot. So I'm hoping that they will look into it and they'll see how to handle it. But we'll get the answer, I think, by the end of the day today, and we'll submit to Nandiba and all the support staff. But as we stand, there's that challenge, Chair, that we've got a session while the NA is on oversight week. So that is where we are, Co-Chair. Back to you.
Chair, can I come in?
Yes, please.
I've just received an email now from the office of the NCOP House Chairperson that they request me to send a revised application whereby it states that the NCOP members would attend the plenaries virtually. But they're saying they have approved it, but they just need me to state it on the application that the NCOP members will attend the plenaries virtually. So that's the new update, Chairperson.
Okay. I think we are therefore advised, co-chair and honorable members, in terms of this updated email, and we will do as such. And let me also indicate, honorable members, that given the decision of the, as we close, given the decision of the special summit of heads of state, of SADC heads of state yesterday, that the semi-DRC mission be ended and that there be a phased withdrawal from the DRC by the members of the member states of the semi-DRC. We then instructed that we write a letter to the minister requesting an urgent briefing on that decision, so that we understand the implications of that decision with regard to our prime mission equipment, and we understand the implications with regard to the SANDF members that are part of the MONUSCO, the UN side of this mission. So as soon as we are advised on the date, we will indicate and schedule a meeting, because we would like to understand now the logistics of the implementation of that decision. So be advised that we have made that instruction to the committee secretariat to write to the minister, so that all the people involved, the chief of the SANDF, the joint chief of operations, prepare themselves to come and brief the committee on that matter. Though this issue, Honorable Niehaus, is not on the agenda of the meeting, it was a briefing, an informal briefing as we close, so that you understand that we've already taken action to ensure the committee is briefed on the matter. But I will take the hands that are there nonetheless. Honorable Niehaus, followed by Honorable Hattie.
Thanks, Chair. I will be very short. I want to appreciate the action that you've taken. This is a very good step that you've taken. But I want to emphasize that we must push that this briefing that we're going to receive from the minister and from the chief of the SANDF must be pretty quickly, soon, because these are critical issues. The matters that you raised about how our prime missionary equipment, and especially our SANDF soldiers who are still under very difficult circumstances in the DRC, in the Eastern DRC, will be repatriated, are absolutely critical. And I want to put on notice now that we must insist, and we mustn't get anyone coming to try and get out of this briefing. We must insist that the chief of the SANDF, the minister, and the particular generals that are part of this whole operational process must be present in the briefing that we receive, and that it must happen sooner rather than later. But thanks so much, Chair, for having taken this initiative. It is a good move that was really needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Hatton.
Thank you, Chair. And also, I would like to add my voice of thanks for you to arrange this. But then I also want to point you out what happened at the previous briefing occasion that we have. I want to read you what was sent out to the media, and I'm referring to the meeting of the 28th of February. Why I'm doing this is that, Chair, I have the feeling that we are dealing with the minister and the SANDF leadership that is not there's more inclined to keep things under the veil than to disclose it. The message that went out to the media is the following, and I'm reading it verbatim. The committee has scheduled a closed meeting with the Minister of Defence, Angie Motshekga, and the leadership of the SANDF on 28th of February for a full briefing, I repeat, a full briefing on the deaths of 14 SANDF soldiers in the DRC. This interaction will include an update on the status of the DRC deployment, the JSCD said. Now, Chair, you will know that we had nothing of this. We had a concocted presentation based on some questions, and there were pages missing and pages were incorrectly an incorrect sequence. So, Chair, in arranging this meeting, I think you should set the rules of engagement, if we have to call it that, because what we have had in the past is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if there's something that should not be shared with the committee, even in committee, it should be said for operational reasons. We cannot divulge any information about the following. And then we know it's sensitive and our lives of our soldiers in wherever they are may be jeopardized by some of the information that will not be handled properly. But Chair, what we've had, our experience with the Minister and the Chief of the SANDF and the leadership is not what I expect from them in this regard. And I think if they want to do something that they've done at Eysterplaat, we might as well at this stage abort this. So, Chair, I appeal to you, please set the rules of engagement. Thank you.
Honorable members, that was an informal brief. I think members are saying that, yes, we should go ahead. We will advise you when the date has been set so that we can convene the meeting. The time now, I want to thank you for attending the meeting and for your robust engagement as ever. And the time now is 6 minutes past 12. We conclude the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.